Houston, Texas. 5th Ward, Lyons Avenue near Jensen Drive. Summer 1995. Approximately 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. The temperature still held at 92 degrees with humidity that made the air feel thick as syrup. The street was active despite the heat. Cars moved slowly along Lyon. Older model Chevrolets and Buicks, some with custom paint jobs and spoke rims, others showing rust and primer spots. Drivers purchasing heroin from dealers who approached vehicles in transactions lasting 15 to 30 seconds. Buyers came from throughout Houston and surrounding suburbs, drawn by 5th Ward's reputation for consistent product quality and availability. The neighborhood known as 5th Ward occupied approximately 7 square miles of Houston's near northeast side, bordered roughly by Interstate 610 to the north, a Buffalo Bayou to the south, Lockwood Drive to the east, and Highway 59 to the west. The area had been home to Houston's African-American working class since the early 20th century, when railroad and shipping industries provided employment and the neighborhood developed its own commercial districts, churches, and social institutions. By the 1990s, that industrial economy had largely collapsed, but the neighborhood's identity remained strong. 5th Ward residents called their area the Nickel, a reference to the ward number that became a badge of geographic and cultural identity. The heroin trade that dominated 5th Ward's illegal economy in the 1990s was not controlled by any single organization or individual whose specific operations are documented in sufficient detail to reconstruct a complete narrative. This represents a significant limitation in available sources. Unlike some drug markets where federal prosecutions created extensive court records documenting organizational structures, leadership, and operations. 5th Ward's heroin trade appears in documentation primarily through fragments. Houston Police Department arrest records showing patterns rather than specific organizational hierarchies. DEA intelligence reports describing general market conditions rather than detailed individual operations. Local journalism covering violence and community impact rather than systematic criminal enterprise, and cultural documentation through hip-hop music that referenced the drug trade but did not provide evidentiary details suitable for historical reconstruction. What can be documented, however, are the systemic conditions that made 5th Ward Houston's primary heroin market, the general patterns of how that market operated, the violence that accompanied drug competition, the cultural significance the neighborhood achieved through its connection to Houston hip-hop, and the community impact of having a drug market operate openly for years. This narrative will distinguish clearly between documented facts and general patterns, acknowledging limitations in available sources rather than inventing details to fill gaps. The economic conditions that created 5th Ward's drug market were documented through census data, employment statistics, and academic research on Houston's deindustrialization. According to 1990 U.S. Census data, the poverty rate in census tracts covering 5th Ward ranged from 35 to 50%, significantly higher than Houston's overall poverty rate of approximately 17%. Unemployment in the area, particularly among young African-American men, exceeded 30% according to labor statistics. The industrial jobs that had sustained previous generations, railroad work, port employment, manufacturing, had largely disappeared as Houston's economy shifted toward energy, medical, and service sectors that required educational credentials many 5th Ward residents lacked. The housing stock reflected this economic decline. According to Houston housing assessments, significant portions of 5th Ward consisted of aging wood frame houses built between 1920 and 1950, many in poor repair. Median home values in 5th Ward were among Houston's lowest. Rental properties, which housed a substantial portion of residents, were frequently substandard, with landlords providing minimal maintenance. The physical environment showed visible signs of disinvestment, vacant lots where houses had been demolished, abandoned buildings, streets with poor drainage and maintenance, limited commercial development beyond small convenience stores and liquor stores. The educational system serving Fifth Ward struggled with challenges common to high-poverty urban areas. Houston Independent School District schools in the area had among the district's lowest test scores, highest dropout rates, and most significant discipline problems. According to HISD data from the mid-1990s, several Fifth Ward schools had graduation rates below 50%. The connection between educational failure and drug market participation, while not deterministic, was documented in research on Houston's drug trade. Limited educational achievement meant limited legitimate employment opportunities, making drug dealing's immediate income attractive to young men facing few alternatives. The heroin that flooded Fifth Ward in the 1990s came primarily from Mexican sources, according to DEA reporting on Houston drug markets. Houston's proximity to the Mexican border and its position as a major transportation hub made it a logical distribution center for Mexican heroin entering the United States. The specific routes and methods are documented in general terms through law enforcement reporting. Heroin was transported from Mexican border cities, primarily Ciudad Juarez, Nuevo Laredo, and Matamoros, to Houston via Interstate 10, Interstate 35, and other highways, hidden in vehicles ranging from private cars to commercial trucks. Once in Houston, the heroin was distributed through neighborhood-level dealers who purchased wholesale quantities and sold retail amounts to users. The heroin market's economics, as documented through law enforcement analysis and academic research on drug markets, followed predictable patterns. Wholesale heroin prices in Houston during the mid-1990s ranged from approximately $50,000 to $80,000 per kilogram, depending on purity and supplier relationships, according to DEA price data. That kilogram, when cut with adulterants to increase volume and sold in small quantities on the street, could generate $200,000 to $300,000 in revenue. And the enormous profit margins, roughly 300 to 500% markup from wholesale to retail, made heroin dealing extremely lucrative for those who could establish and maintain operations. Fifth Ward's heroin market operated openly in ways that shocked even law enforcement familiar with urban drug markets. According to Houston Police Department reports and Houston Chronicle journalism from the period, heroin dealing occurred on street corners, in parking lots, and from specific houses throughout the day and night. Buyers could drive through the neighborhood and purchase heroin as easily as making any retail transaction. The openness reflected both the volume of the market, sufficient customer traffic that discretion was less important than availability, and the limited effectiveness of law enforcement in disrupting operations. The violence that accompanied Fifth Ward's heroin trade, while substantial, was not as extreme as crack-related violence in other cities during the same period. This distinction is significant and reflects differences in market structure and drug effects. Heroin markets, according to research on drug-related violence, typically generate less violence than crack or powder cocaine markets because heroin users are less prone to erratic behavior and because heroin markets often develop stable territorial arrangements where dealers establish recognized territories that reduce conflict. However, Fifth Ward still experienced significant violence related to drug trade competition, enforcement of organizational rules, and robberies targeting dealers. According to Houston Police Department homicide data compiled by the Houston Chronicle, Fifth Ward consistently ranked among Houston's most violent areas throughout the 1990s, with murder rates substantially above city averages. While not all murders were drug-related, law enforcement and community sources indicated that a significant portion involved disputes over drug territory, robberies of dealers, or enforcement of drug organization rules. Specific documented incidents, when they appear in news reporting, typically describe shootings at or near known drug-dealing locations, victims with criminal histories suggesting drug trade involvement, and investigations that struggled to identify suspects due to witness non-cooperation. The organizational structure of Fifth Ward's heroin trade, to the extent it can be reconstructed from available sources, thus appears to have been fragmented rather than dominated by a single crew or individual. This represents the most significant limitation in applying a traditional rise to dominance narrative to Fifth Ward's story. The available evidence suggests multiple independent or loosely affiliated groups operated simultaneously, controlling different sections of the neighborhood and competing for market share, rather than one organization achieving comprehensive control. This fragmentation had several causes that can be identified through analysis, even when specific organizational details remain undocumented. First, the geographic size of Fifth Ward, approximately 7 square miles with numerous potential dealing locations, made comprehensive control by a single organization logistically difficult. Second, the steady supply of heroin from Mexican sources meant that any dealer with capital and connections could enter the market rather than requiring permission from or supply from a dominant local organization. Third, law enforcement pressure, while insufficient to eliminate the drug trade, was sufficient to prevent any single organization from achieving the visibility and scale that would make it a priority target for federal prosecution. The cultural significance that Fifth Ward achieved in the 1990s derived primarily from its connection to Houston hip-hop, particularly the Screwed Up Click and the lean culture pioneered by DJ Screw. Robert Davis, known as DJ Screw, was a Fifth Ward resident who developed the chopped and screwed technique of slowing down hip-hop tracks to match the sedated feeling of codeine promethazine cough syrup mixed with soda, a combination called lean, or syrup, that became central to Houston drug culture. DJ Screw's music, which referenced Fifth Ward extensively and featured local rappers, including many with connections to the neighborhood street economy, made Fifth Ward legendary in Southern hip-hop culture. The intersection of drug culture and hip-hop culture in Fifth Ward was complex and consequential. According to interviews with Houston hip-hop artists and analysis by music journalists and academics, many individuals were simultaneously involved in both music and street economics. The same blocks that produced heroin dealers produced rappers, and in some cases the same individuals pursued both activities. This intersection meant that Fifth Ward's drug trade achieved cultural documentation through music even when it lacked the detailed evidentiary documentation of federal prosecutions. DJ Screw's music, while not providing evidence suitable for prosecution, documented Fifth Ward street culture with ethnographic detail. The Screw tapes, hundreds of mixtapes recorded in the 1990s, featured Houston rappers describing drug dealing, violence, and street life with specificity that matched the general patterns law enforcement observed, but with cultural insider perspective that outside observers lacked. The music's references to specific Fifth Ward locations, to heroin dealing, to violence, and to the daily reality of street life in the Nickel created a cultural record that supplemented official documentation. The relationship between codeine use and heroin use in Fifth Ward created public health concerns documented in medical and public health research. Codeine promethazine cough syrup, while legal when prescribed by doctors, was obtained illegally through fraudulent prescriptions, theft, or purchase from corrupt medical sources. The sedating effects of codeine, particularly when mixed with alcohol or used in large quantities, were similar to heroin's effects. According to public health researchers studying Houston drug culture, some codeine users transitioned to heroin when prescription sources became unavailable or when heroin proved cheaper. And this created a pipeline from a drug glorified in music culture to a drug with much more severe health and addiction consequences. Law enforcement's response to Fifth Ward's drug trade was documented through HPD activity reports, media coverage of police operations, and community complaints about inadequate policing. Houston Police Department conducted regular narcotics enforcement operations in Fifth Ward throughout the 1990s, making hundreds of arrests annually. However, the effectiveness of these operations in reducing drug market activity was limited by systemic factors that affected urban drug enforcement generally. The arrest and replacement cycle was well documented. Police would arrest street-level dealers, who would be replaced within hours or days, and others willing to take the same risks for the same profits. Unless enforcement targeted suppliers and organization leadership, street-level arrests had minimal impact on market operations. Federal involvement through DEA and FBI was episodic rather than sustained, focused on larger trafficking organizations rather than neighborhood-level distribution. The result was that Fifth Ward's heroin market operated with minimal sustained disruption despite regular law enforcement presence. Community impact of Fifth Ward's drug trade was documented through multiple sources including public health data, educational outcomes, crime statistics, and community organization advocacy. The presence of an open drug market affected residents who had no involvement with drugs directly through several mechanisms. Property values in areas with visible drug activity were depressed, trapping homeowners in declining neighborhoods. The visibility of drug dealing and drug use normalized illegal activity for children growing up in the area, according to educators and youth services providers working in Fifth Ward. Violence associated with drug trade, even when targeted at participants, affected the broader community through stray bullets, trauma, and fear that constrained daily activities. The public health consequences of Houston's heroin trade, concentrated significantly in Fifth Ward, were documented through hospital emergency room data and medical examiner statistics. Heroin overdoses, which had declined in the 1980s as crack cocaine dominated drug markets, increased in the 1990s as heroin purity increased and prices decreased. According to Harris County Medical Examiner data, heroin-related deaths in Houston increased substantially during the mid to late 1990s. While not all deaths occurred in Fifth Ward, the neighborhood's role as a distribution center meant many users who overdosed elsewhere had purchased heroin there. HIV transmission through injection drug use was another documented health consequence. According to Houston Department of Health data, injection drug users represented a significant portion of new HIV infections in the city during the 1990s. Fifth Ward, with its concentration of heroin use and dealing, was identified as a high-risk area. Public health interventions, including needle exchange programs, faced political opposition despite evidence of effectiveness in reducing disease transmission. The eventual transformation of Fifth Ward's drug market came not through a decisive law enforcement victory or a single criminal organization's dominance, but through gradual changes in multiple factors affecting Houston's heroin trade. The specific timeline and mechanisms are less well documented than the earlier period's conditions, because the changes were incremental rather than dramatic, and because reduced violence and drug visibility meant reduced media coverage and research attention. Several factors appear to have contributed based on available evidence. First, increased federal immigration enforcement along the Texas-Mexico border in the late 1990s and early 2000s made heroin smuggling more risky and expensive, according to DEA reporting. This did not eliminate supply, but may have reduced the abundance that characterized the mid-1990s market. Second, demographic changes in Houston generally and Fifth Ward specifically altered neighborhood dynamics. According to census data, Houston's Hispanic population grew substantially in the 1990s, while the city's African American population grew more slowly. Some traditionally African American neighborhoods, including portions of Fifth Ward, experienced demographic transition that disrupted established social networks, including those supporting drug distribution. Third, urban development and gentrification began affecting areas near downtown Houston, including portions of Fifth Ward closest to the city center. According to property records and development reporting, real estate investment in some Fifth Ward areas increased in the late 1990s and especially after 2000. While much of Fifth Ward remained poor and underdeveloped, the beginning of gentrification pressure in some areas made open drug markets less tenable as property values increased and wealthier residents moved in. Fourth, the impact of federal sentencing on Houston's drug trade, while not specific to Fifth Ward, removed many experienced dealers from the streets for extended periods. The federal mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes that were established in the 1980s and applied aggressively in the 1990s meant that dealers convicted in federal court faced prison terms of 10, 20, or more years. According to federal sentencing data for the Southern District of Texas, hundreds of individuals were sentenced annually for federal drug crimes during the 1990s, many receiving lengthy mandatory minimums. This incarceration removed individuals from Fifth Ward and other neighborhoods, though whether it reduced overall drug activity is disputed given the replacement phenomenon where new dealers took over for incarcerated ones. The legacy of Fifth Ward's 1990s heroin trade persists in multiple forms. Culturally, the neighborhood remains legendary in Southern hip-hop, with Fifth Ward referenced constantly in Houston rap music and the screwed-up Click's influence continuing to shape the genre. DJ Screw died in 2000 from a codeine overdose at age 29. But his musical legacy and the culture he helped create remained central to Houston's identity. Multiple Houston rappers who achieved national success, including members of the Screwed-Up Click, came from Fifth Ward, carrying the neighborhood's reputation beyond Houston. Economically and socially, Fifth Ward continues to struggle with poverty, crime, and limited opportunities, despite some areas seeing development and investment. According to current census data and Houston planning documents, much of Fifth Ward remains among Houston's poorest neighborhoods, with many of the same challenges that characterized the area in the 1990s. High unemployment, limited educational attainment, substandard housing, and crime above city averages. The drug trade that dominated the 1990s has evolved but not disappeared, with heroin continuing to be available alongside other drugs, including methamphetamine and synthetic opioids that have emerged in recent years. The public health legacy includes ongoing struggles with addiction, HIV, hepatitis C, and other consequences of injection drug use that affected individuals who used heroin during the 1990s and who continued to struggle with addiction decades later. Houston's treatment infrastructure, which was inadequate during the 1990s, according to public health assessments, remains strained by demand for addiction treatment services exceeding available capacity. The criminal justice legacy includes thousands of individuals incarcerated for Fifth Ward drug crimes during the 1990s, many serving or having served lengthy federal and state sentences. And according to Texas Department of Criminal Justice data and Federal Bureau of Prison Statistics, hundreds of individuals from Fifth Ward area zip codes were incarcerated in state and federal prisons for drug crimes prosecuted in the 1990s. The collateral consequences of this mass incarceration: children growing up without fathers, families losing income, individuals emerging from prison after years or decades with limited prospects, continue affecting Fifth Ward communities. The story of Houston's Fifth Ward in the 1990s is not a story of any individual's rise to dominance, but rather a story of how systemic forces, economic devastation from deindustrialization, proximity to Mexican drug sources, inadequate law enforcement resources, limited legitimate opportunities for residents, created conditions where a heroin market operated openly for years. The fragmentation of that market, with multiple crews competing rather than one organization dominating, reflected both the neighborhood's size and complexity, and the limitations of attempting comprehensive control in an urban drug market with multiple entry points and constant pressure from law enforcement. Understanding Fifth Ward requires recognizing that the heroin trade was not imposed on the neighborhood from outside, but developed within the community as individuals responded rationally to the opportunities and constraints they faced. Young men growing up in Fifth Ward in the 1980s and 1990s faced legitimate employment prospects that were limited by inadequate education, discrimination, and an economy that had fewer opportunities for workers without advanced skills or credentials. Drug dealing offered immediate income, status within a street culture that provided identity and belonging, and excitement that contrasted with the limited options legitimate employment provided. The choice to deal drugs was not irrational or pathological, but was a logical response to conditions that made illegal income more accessible and lucrative than legal alternatives. The violence that accompanied Fifth Ward's drug trade, while substantial, was lower than crack-related violence in cities like New York or Los Angeles during the same period. This relative reduction in violence reflected heroin market characteristics: users who were less prone to erratic behavior than crack users, markets that developed stable territorial arrangements more easily than the chaotic crack markets of the late 1980s. But the violence was still real and consequential for those killed, injured, or traumatized, and for communities where children grew up understanding that gunfire was normal and death was routine. The cultural legacy through Houston hip-hop represents an unusual case, where a legal street economy was documented not through law enforcement records, but through artistic expression. DJ Screw and the Screwed Up Clique created an archive of 1990s Fifth Ward street culture that preserved language, attitudes, values, and daily realities that official documentation missed. This cultural documentation is valuable for understanding how participants in the drug trade understood their own activities, even as it lacks the evidentiary specificity needed for legal or historical proof of particular facts. The limitation of this narrative, its inability to provide the detailed reconstruction of specific individuals' strategic rise to power, reflects the limitation of available sources. Unlike drug markets, where major federal prosecutions created comprehensive documentation through wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, and trial testimony, Fifth Ward's market operated below the level that generated such intensive federal investigation. The result is that the story can be told systemically and culturally, but not through the individual strategic narrative that some drug market stories permit. This limitation should not be understood as diminishing the significance or reality of what occurred in Fifth Ward. Thousands of Houston residents were affected by the neighborhood's heroin trade, users who became addicted, dealers who were killed or imprisoned, families who lost members to death or incarceration, children who grew up surrounded by drugs and violence, community members who endured a drug market's presence for years. The impact was real and substantial, even when the detailed mechanics of organizational power struggles remain undocumented. The story of Fifth Ward's heroin trade is the story of a neighborhood shaped by economic forces beyond its control, residents making choices within severely constrained options, a drug market that operated according to economic logics that made sense to participants even as they generated harm, law enforcement that responded but could not fundamentally alter market dynamics. Scam and a cultural legacy that made one Houston neighborhood legendary in hip-hop, even as it struggled with poverty and crime. This is the documented history of Fifth Ward in the 1990s. Incomplete in some details, but clear in its outline and consequences.